So, you've heard this story before? Yeah? Troubling in a way. You have to sort of twist it around to make it life-giving, but it is. Jesus says, it's not right to give the food of the children to the dogs. Now, I never hear this part of Holy Scripture that I don't think of the prayer of humble access. Do you remember the prayer of humble access from Rite One? If you've been in the Episcopal Church most of your life, you will have heard it. Maybe you remember it. We used to say it before we took communion. It's still in the prayer book, but we don't use that prayer very often. But here's what it says. If you know it, you can say it with me. We do not presume to come to this thy table, O merciful Lord, trusting in our own righteousness, but in thy manifold and great mercies. We are not worthy so much as to gather up the crumbs under thy table. But thou art the same Lord, whose property is always to have mercy. Grant, therefore, gracious Lord, so to eat the flesh of thy dear Son, Jesus Christ, and to drink his blood, that we may evermore dwell in him, and he in us. Amen. You know, before you come to the presence of the Lord, it's all right to get a little humble. That's how I used to feel about it. I still do. And I've always loved that prayer because it reminds me that as difficult as it is for me to admit, I'm not all that. Right? I'm not all that. I'm not the center of my universe, even though that's how I think and talk and act and even pray most of the time. I'm not the center of the universe, God is. And at least for me, a healthy dose of humility has never been a bad thing. But there's a big difference between humility and humiliation. Am I right? One is a self-motivated desire for right relationship. You humble yourself. But the other is a shaming and denigration used intentionally to put or keep someone else in their place. There's a big difference, you guys, between making a decision to have a seat and being told, sit down. There's a difference between choosing to hold your tongue and being told, shut up. And if I'm being honest, today's text puts me in the difficult position of wondering how Jesus, who is God after all, could speak such words that are, to the modern ear at least, unloving, unkind, less than generous, remarkably ungodlike. Jesus' words to the Canaanite woman sound to my ear borderline humiliating. And I don't like it. I didn't say I didn't love Jesus. I totally love Jesus. Okay, let's be clear. But is this the Jesus that I know? Frankly, it doesn't sound like him. Which brings up one of the problems with reading Scripture. One of the problems with reading Scripture is that just about the time you think you have a clear picture of who God is and what God is up to, you read something that makes you go, what? That does not sound like God, right? That's not what I expected God to do or God to say. It happens a lot, I think, if you read Scripture. Which is why I love to read Scripture with you. Because reading Scripture together brings life to a community. It creates vitality. It brings up doubt, which offers sometimes assurance. And it leads ultimately to a real and lasting faith. Don't forget to read Scripture together. See, part of the difficulty is we don't want to let God be God. Do we? Do you? You don't want to let God be God. Right? We have always wanted God to be human, haven't we? Attributed human attributes to God? Haven't we? Is God a man? Let's start with that. Right? Does God sit on a throne? Does God have a long white beard? Well, if so, what razors does God use? Right? A sharpened ram's horn, or a Schick 5-blade, or that Norelco thing with 3 heads that Santa rides? What does God sit on a throne? Does God ever have to get up? How does he keep from gaining weight? Right? We have always attributed human characteristics to God, whether or not they actually apply. Does God look like us? Well, it does say we're made in God's image. It does. Does God act like us? I don't know. Sometimes. There's a lot of stuff we give to God in the Old Testament particularly that sounds like us. Does God love like us? Please, no. Please, God, love better than we love. Yeah? Does God forgive like us? Again, better, I hope. The question for first century Christian Jewish communities, Matthew, the question for those folks was, does God exclude like us? But the question for modern people really is, does God include like us? So here's the deal. God has a plan, and God didn't ask me about it. Hard for me to accept that, but it's the truth. I have to let God be God, as hard and as humbling as that is. And God's plan in my reading of Scripture seems to be that the world will be blessed, but first the Jews will be blessed. That's the way I read it. The promise is that the nations, that's us, will be blessed through the blessing that God promised Abraham and his descendants. And that scriptural fact brings us to the difficult heart of today's reading about the Canaanite woman. Jesus is on the move. And he's way, way out of his intended mission field. At least the mission field that he was personally in the flesh to walk and work while he was alive. The towns of Sidon and Tyre are 40 and 50 miles north and west of Galilee, his home base. And they're about 100 miles from Jerusalem, which is the heart of his faith. And so in our text, he heads up there to what is no man's land for Jews and Jewish rabbis. He is in enemy territory, foreign territory, dangerous place, difficult people. And he and his disciples are walking along, and this lady, our heroine in the story, she starts harassing them. Hey, 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 hey! She's not a Jew, okay? She is not a believer in the God of the Jews or the Son of David, even though she uses those terms to address Jesus. Even though she calls him Lord, he ignores her. He ignores her. Keeps walking. But she keeps it up, our hero. Because, well, I don't know why, really. Except that her daughter is sick. And she believes that Jesus can do something about it. It's like finding out that your child has a fatal disease, and then discovering that there's a cure, but your insurance company denies access to it because it is uncovered or out of network. Jesus is out of network for this woman. Yeah? But she persists. And finally, Jesus turns and engages her and tells her the thing that is so hard for me to understand, that God has a plan, and although it seems harsh, even he, Jesus, doesn't have the authority to change it. Now, remember that I said earlier that part of our problem with reading Scripture is that we want God to be human. Well, a similar and equally difficult problem for us is that we want Jesus to be fully God and not fully God and fully human as we profess that he is. We don't want Jesus to have any human side. So if you're offended when I say that Jesus can't change God's plan, that's why it offends you. And don't try to fix it, just feel it, because it's important and it's the point of the story, really. Anyway, Jesus tells her, I was only sent to the lost sheep of Israel. But she persists. She kneels at his feet in humility and begs, Lord, help me. Now, it's super hard for us to imagine God not helping her, isn't it? It is for me. But Jesus goes on with what can only be described now as an insult. He says, it's not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs. Ouch, right? Direct hit to her heart. To her humanity, even. But she persists. Our hero is not deterred. She says, yes, Lord, yet even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table. Aha! Now that does it, right? she has bested Jesus in this argument, or trapped him with his own words, or taught him something about himself and his ministry, or taught him something about a mother's love. I don't know for certain what the correct meaning of this story is, or if there is one correct meaning. I'm only reading the text with you and asking it to reveal something honest and true about God for us this morning. And this is what I hear God saying to us in this text. I have a plan. You're in it. I don't bend to your will because I am God. But I do stoop to hear your supplication and your prayers and your determined cries for love, for justice, for mercy, for grace and peace. Persist, I hear God saying. Persist. Demand these things. You are fully human. Don't let anybody tell you otherwise. I am and have always been fully God, God says. And Jesus, my beloved, the anointed one, the Christ, is the bridge between humanity and God. He has now come to you. He will lead you to the truth. He will bring you into the kingdom. You have now found him, or he has now found you. Now follow him. Love, justice, mercy, grace, and peace, these are all possible. Persist.